Buenas noches a todos. Empezamos con nuestra última reunión y tenemos con nosotros dos representantes de Alemania y por eso yo voy a cambiar el idioma a inglés, que ellos también entienden que hablamos. So good evening, dear friends. The closing session is now with two guests from Germany, as when I listened to this Congress and we were asked to host these two persons from Germany. One is Ulrich Lechte. He's a federal deputy or a MP of the Liberal Party in Germany, and my colleague Maximilian Spohr is from the head office of the Naumann Foundation, responsible for the human rights work of the Naumann Foundation worldwide. And they are our guests for 1 week in Buenos Aires, but when I heard we had this Congress, so I thought it's a good idea to come with them here to talk to you again, because this topic, human rights and trade, is also very, very important. And my friend from Germany, from the Liberal Party, will start with his contributions. It's about the World Trade and the World Trade Organization, and then our colleague from the head office about the human rights will talk about the sustainability of human rights and with regard to these topics. Just 10-15 minutes, and then the floor is open as always for the Naumann Foundation for discussions and for questions, and I can only encourage you to make use of that. Thank you very much. And now please, the word is yours.
Yeah, good evening. I'm happy to be with you here. I'm a member of parliament in Germany. I'm there in the Committee of Foreign Affairs, and it's my pleasure to be the man for South America, Africa, and Australia, Oceania from my party and for the UN. And out of that point of view, I achieved to get the chair of the Undercommittee for United Nations, international organizations, and globalization in the German parliament. So 10,000 kilometers yesterday made me come here to you in Rosario today. We had a lovely drive from Buenos Aires over here, and today I had my first car accident here in Rosario when a taxi driver was a sandwich made by 3 other cars. So we were bumped to the 2 cars in front of us. It was a really nice situation. So now I'm coming to my speech. I want to talk about free trade needs to be rule-based trade, the crisis of the world trade system, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So dear ladies and gentlemen, dear students of Rosario and guests of near and far, the multilateral system in general is in crisis, and that also includes the multilateral trading system in particular, and its most important institution, the World Trade Organization. The WTO Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires in December 2017 was not able to achieve any agreement on the reduction of trade distorting or disturbing practices. But this only means that there is no progress towards more free trade. In addition to this lack of progress, there is the much bigger problem that what has already been achieved in terms of free trade is under attack. US President Donald Trump has started a trade war with many of its trading partners. His complaints about unfair trade practices are not all fake news. He has some valid points. Market access for foreign investors in China is very difficult, for example. At the same time, Chinese state-owned companies have a lot more open access in other WTO countries, including the US, as well as many European and African countries. If foreign companies manage to be active in China, the intellectual property is frequently being violated. These are valid points, but with the WTO, we have established procedures to address these trade distortions. We have the WTO dispute settlement system, where such disputes can be settled in a rule-based system. And in the interest of free and fair trade, we need such a rules-based system where every participant is equal before the international law. We need the rule of law instead of the rule of the jungle, where the strongest decides and succeeds. But while the US used to support the WTO in its dispute settlement system in the past, they decided to turn against it. They are blocking nominations of new judges for the appellation body of the WTO. From a total of 7 judges, 3 positions are currently vacant. The remaining 4 judges are already overworked with the rising number of trade disputes. The term of the 4th judge ends on December the 13th, 2018. Then we are down to only 3 judges on the appellate body, which is the minimum number required for a panel. If one of those judges is prejudiced for a specific case, we already cannot form a panel then. And the terms of 2 more judges will end on 10th of December 2019. Then at least the dispute settlement system will be inoperable if the US keep up their policy of blocking the nomination of new judges. So the US are putting stress on the WTO from 2 sides. On the one side, they are increasing the number of disputes by starting trade wars. We have already complaints by the EU, Canada, Mexico, India, and China. And on the other side, they push the dispute settlement system towards being inoperable. It is especially odd that this comes from the United States, a country that used to be an advocate of the free trade. The office of the President of the US used to be considered synonymous with the leader of the free world. But after Trump was elected, the outgoing President Obama and many others have suggested that German Chancellor Angela Merkel should be the new leader of the free world. Well, with all due respect for Angela Merkel, my Chancellor, but I have some doubts that she can follow in these footsteps. And she herself is rather uncomfortable with being called leader of the free world. But maybe there's no need to have a single leader of the free world. This is more a collective effort anyway, a task for many state leaders all over the world. I was quite impressed by the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, who was able to negotiate a ceasefire for the trade war between the US and the EU on June the 25th. But that doesn't mean that we are out of trouble. We need to restart negotiations about a free trade agreement, an endeavor undertaken earlier under the name Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or short TTIP. But TTIP negotiations were halted by Trump earlier, and now he agreed to Juncker that he wants something similar. Well, we will see where that goes. I'm coming to the end. The magazine The Economist had an interesting theory about Donald Trump and his chief trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, playing some sort of a good cop, bad cop game. But one where Donald Trump plays the bad cop without really knowing what he is doing. He threatens to destroy the WTO, thereby bringing all others to rally around the WTO to protect it and proceed with reforms to make it even better. Such reforms could include new rules for state-owned enterprises, for example. They could also include a departure from the consensus method when it comes to the nomination of new judges. I hope very much that this is true. It reminds me a bit of what followed after the British had their Brexit referendum and Theresa May declared the intention of the United Kingdom to leave the EU. As a result of this, the remaining European Union was more united than before. This does not mean that there are no more differences between the remaining European states. There are certainly several. But with such a rejection of the EU as whole by the Brexit decision, the other EU states rallied around the EU to protect it. I hope this is also what we will see with the WTO. I hope the attack on the World Trade Organization by Trump will bring the rest of the world closer together in protection of the multilateral trading system and in revitalizing the WTO. The rules-based system of world trade where every participant is equal before the international law is for the benefit of all, and therefore we should all support it. Thank you very much for your attention and invitation to come to Rosario. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Is this loud enough? Yeah, I think, yeah. So yeah, good evening also from my side. I see we don't have direct translation, so please, I tend to speak very fast, and please just wave if I'm speeding too much. But yeah, thank you very much, Congressman, which would be called here, I think, for highlighting a very important aspect of how international trade and a globalized economy is coming under attack. To bridge, or to build a bridge in order to what I'm trying to sort of highlight here in this short debate that we'll have. The connection there, I think, is really that there's also another aspect of international trade that, at least in our country and within the European Union, has come under stark attack, and that's say the sustainability of international trade and a globalized economy. To give a brief overview of where we are in that process, I'm well aware that I'm a lawyer, a human rights lawyer, speaking in front of a economy congress, which is of course a challenge. I'm happy that you're all still here. A lot of people are already leaving if they hear that term, but I think it's a very valid aspect, which I'll touch upon later, talking about free trade agreements, and something that's, I think, very relevant also for this country at the moment. So sustainability questions has been asked in the context of international trade, of course, for quite some time, but more towards the environmental angle. So we faced challenges and questions of how to solve negative impact on the environment, which was connected to international trade. Currently, this debate is taking a few steps further, and same as in the environmental debate, Germany is very much at the forefront in these kind of topics, and specifically the European Union too. We have an ongoing process on the international level, which is basically framed around the term of business and human rights. That majorly refers to the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights that were passed in 2011. I'm not sure how many of the people in the audience are aware of that process. It is, if you want to put it into a nutshell, it's the question of how we mitigate negative impact of international trade on human rights. To give you an example, one of the cases that rose most attention in Europe was the burning down of a factory, a garment factory in Pakistan in 2012. So a factory fire broke out, and about 1,300 workers burned in the flames because there were no specific and fire regulations and escape routes. In the ashes of this factory, they found a label of the German company KIK. KIK means in German, the customer is the king. So currently, this company is being sued in front of a German court for damages because they are being held responsible in the name of the relatives of the deceased workers, that they would have had a responsibility to pay more attention to the situation of their workers producing the garments that they're selling in Germany. Similar cases, I think, from South America are coming from the extractive sector. I believe neighboring countries like Brazil have severe issues with human rights violations connected to the extractive sector, artisanal gold mining, for example. So in general, the question that we are sort of exposed to is the question how we sort of further promote international trade, a globalized economy, without having too many negative side effects. I'm mentioning this topic because I think, at least from our perspective in the European Union, these negative effects are having a major impact of the support of, for example, free trade agreements. So you have major opposition to free trade agreements at all. The free trade agreement with the United States was massively criticized by, of course, more left-wing groups, but there's a lot of questions being asked, and not so many people. And I mean, this is certainly a problem for us as a liberal organization. More and more people losing trust that a further globalized economy is really making life better for most people. So what we're facing currently is a process at the United Nations. The so-called guiding principles. They establish a so-called human rights responsibility of business, which actually, if you want to sort of put it in one sentence, what it is, it's actually a human rights due diligence. So companies, businesses are being asked to be diligent about how their supply chain, how their value chain affecting human rights. Of course, this is not the easiest thing to do if you think about today's global value chain having sometimes 10 to 15 parts everywhere in the world, and it's very difficult for a German small or medium enterprise to understand how exactly its factory is being sourcing in a faraway place in Pakistan. So currently, I think also here in South America, this process is going forward quite slowly. You see the implementation of these guiding principles, which were all signed by the member states of the United Nations and the Human Rights Council in 2011. You see these implementation done by national action plans that would ideally result into a law that makes this due diligence a legal obligation by businesses. I mean, you can see what this has, what implication this can have for businesses if they have to sort of fulfill transparency regulations that puts them into a position where they have to know their supply chain until all the way up to, for example, Central Africa, where they source minerals. So I think here in Central and South America, we only have Colombia with such a national action plan that was passed a few years ago, and just currently Chile. I think it's being discussed in Argentina as well, but it's, I think, still at a very early stage. You can see, I mean, Naumann Foundation is certainly an organization who wants to combine its expertise on human rights, but also specifically its expertise on business, because you can see these two worlds, they seldomly connect, and I think both sides often don't have the broadest understanding. I think a very relevant aspect of this whole topic is the current debate in the European Union about the so-called sustainability chapters in free trade agreement. So now I'm carefully sort of touching upon a field which is certainly not my expertise, but as far as I'm informed, the current situation with free trade agreements here in this region of the world is rather fragmented. I believe that there was a process of developing a free trade agreement with the Mercosur states. Currently, we have a preliminary implementation with Peru since 2013 and with Ecuador since last year, I believe. So the free trade agreements that the European Union is closing at the moment, they have a standardized chapter on sustainability that would revolve around social issues such as labor standards. It includes binding regulations for the parties of this treaty, of the free trade agreement, that would obligate them to respect, for example, the core ILO conventions. It contains structures to involve civil society organizations in the implementations of these responsibilities. And ultimately, it also calls for mitigation systems so that people who feel that they're being negatively affected by free trade agreements can have somebody so they can sort of bring their claims forward to. Besides this, the free trade agreements that the European Union is closing at the moment always have a standardized human rights clause, which also sort of obligates all parties to the agreement to respect the core international human rights obligations. So if I'm rightly informed, there are currently debates also for a free trade agreement between the European Union and Argentina. I think just in March 2007, there was an Argentina-EU joint committee meeting, which will bring this whole issue forward. I mean, it only came, of course, into question since since before 2015, it was not really an issue to discuss, but it is probably very likely. I mean, you would probably have to tell me how likely it is that we're seeing such an agreement in the future with Argentina. But I think there's a lot of momentum for such an agreement. And I think it is certainly the people that are assembled in this room who would be the forces who would bring such an agreement forward. But if we do so, it is, I think, very interesting to look into the current debate about these sustainability questions around free trade agreements. We currently, just to bring you sort of the latest sort of level of the debate, the European Commission just issued a non-paper in 2018, just in February. And just to give you a background, these sustainability chapters, they are already, I mean, the European Commission regards them as a successful tool to mitigate negative effects of free trade agreements. They've issued a report in 2017, which comes to that conclusion. However, there are a lot of groups who would advocate for these sustainability and human rights aspects of free trade agreements developing more teeth. And so knowing the European Union, we know that they have a lot of these groups, political movements, the green movements. They have a lot of impetus, they have a lot of impact, and also to sort of prepare debates, and I think also the debate here in Argentina, it's very interesting to look into what the European Union would expect to be part of such a sustainability clause, a sustainability chapter in such a free trade agreement in the future. I think what the also a lot of NGOs, human rights NGOs, criticizing about these chapters is basically that they are taken out of the whole agreement. So the chapters follow at the last part of the free trade agreement, and therefore sort of taken out of the actual content of the agreements. Hence, the aspects that are being negotiated and agreed on in these chapters, they are not part of the entire mitigation system. So most of you will probably know this better than I do, but all free trade agreements, they of course have a system if one of the party wouldn't follow what was agreed. So if you don't make the sustainability aspects and also the human rights clause part of that, what impact will it have? So this is one aspect where the discussion revolves around. Another important aspect is that a lot of human rights groups also call for the human rights clauses not being just rhetoric. So within these human rights clauses, both parties agree, of course, not to violate any of the named worker standards or human rights. But if they do, the only effect that it will have is further consultations. So a lot of groups that have a lot of impact in the European Union will call for a clause that would ultimately lead to an end or a suspension of the free trade agreement if one of the parties would violate the respected human rights. So you can see already that this is certainly something that a lot of experts like yourselves who would sort of involve in the actual aspects of such a free trade agreement wouldn't necessarily probably have as the first thing they would think about. But we are really happy to sort of open up a debate, also because I think it should not only be Eurocentric, because I talk with a lot of human rights groups that are from Europe or from Germany that tell me a lot of the things, what's happening in the global south or in South America. And I often go there and ask to the people, and they look at me and say, well, I mean, why don't you just ask us? How do you know so much if you're not even being here? So it's, I think, definitely a discussion we should lead both ways. And just in this very short presentation, I just sort of wanted to highlight a few points. Of course, Naumann Foundation will here to continue this debate and to maybe develop an expertise on it and not just an opinion. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Yeah, Federico. Do you have a microphone? Yeah.
Hola, hola. Hello. Thank you very much for both your presentations. Sorry, I have a question and comment for the both of you. Sorry, Congressman, during your presentation I had to leave because it's the curse of the organizer, so I hope I'm not asking
I can
something.
give you the text, I have 2 copies of it.
I hope I'm not asking something you already said. My question to you is whether you believe that Germany and Argentina also, who are very much trying to push for the agreement between Mercosur and the European Union, will be able to defeat the protectionists from France and Brazil, basically. And one comment to Dr. Spohr, I really enjoyed your talk and your concerns, but also and for instance, Ben Powell, one of the keynote speakers of a former conference here, he has studied sweatshops, so-called sweatshops, a lot, and he has found out, among other things, that people feel themselves much better at the so-called sweatshops than working in the farms, in the open air and dying when they are, 18. And when we see the historical, progress of Europe, Europe did not develop by using the environmental and social clauses that wants to impose in a way towards more underdeveloped countries like ourselves, and that in a way it could be a little bit unfair. Of course, we want to abandon all those practices, but probably we are not rich enough yet. Thank you very much.
Well. At first, I would like to state that Germany is a country with a bunch of political views. And so it is with free trade and globalization. And there are enemies to free trade and globalization as well in Germany. And as always, when people who have their brains in their heads we're talking about free trade, everybody knows that is the best answer, free trade over the whole world without customs and all that stuff, for overcoming hunger, poverty and all that stuff. But in Germany, they were discussing when TTIP was on march. They were discussing about points like what's going to be with chicken. So in America, chicken is done with claw chicken, yeah, and getting out of diseases and all that stuff. And in Europe, we are feeding medicamentation to the chickens to get rid of everything in it. Both things are not that good as they are, but I think that the claw thing of America is better than what we are doing, feeding medicine to chicken. But that was the main topic of the whole TTIP treaty for weeks and weeks in German press, and what was done by German people. And now we got a trade agreement between a trade treaty between Europe, free trade, and Japan, without any problem. With Canada, they were talking like, ooh, that could be the door for the US coming to Europe and install a system we all don't want to have, hire and fire and all that stuff. So it's always really hard to get the meaning of the people fond of free trade. But I think that with Argentina there won't be any problem, because Argentina, in the German side, that's a lovely country with lovely people. They are all doing tango the whole day, yeah. And I see that you're sitting around and listening to a German parliamentarian without doing tango moves. So I think a EU or German Argentina free treaty agreement won't be any problem, free trade agreement. But it depends on with whom you are doing it right by now in Europe. I would say that's the correct answer for his question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, and as I expected, if you go to the global south and ask these questions, or address the whole sustainability questions and human rights questions related to trade and business, you get exactly that answer. And obviously, you're absolutely right. And I will chicken out a little bit of your question, saying that I'm, of course, in the field of environmental regulation. We are absolutely clear. We have a lot of the European or so-called Western industrial countries who, of course, used many more of the resources to develop their economies without these strict economic and social regulations that other developing countries or upcoming countries are facing right now. But maybe also, so I'd probably focus a little bit more on the human rights question. And here, first of all, I want to maybe also clarify that a lot of the organizations in, for example, Germany who would work on that topic are rather focusing of transnational corporations. So it's not so much the challenge to sort of impose more regulations in these kinds of on a country like Argentina. It's much more attacking, for example, a German company who's sourcing from a country in the global south, for example, and putting them on a lot of regulation. But then, of course, a lot of people ask, this is something the rule of law in these specific countries should take care of. But I think not so much in Argentina maybe, but in a country like Bangladesh, of course, you have at the moment a rule of law system which is just simply not in a position to deal with a massive impact. I mean, if you think about the fact that 69 or 70 of the 100 world's biggest economic entities are no longer states, but private sector entities, private sector companies, we of course have to discuss sort of what do we do about it. A lot of, let's say more left-wing political forces there call for regulation, imposing laws, and we've actually seeing such a process at the moment in European Union. So France has passed the law, so-called devoir de diligence. The UK has a Modern Slavery Act since 2016. We have awaiting a Child Labour Act in Netherlands, and several regulations in the EU. CSR reporting, non-financial reporting, is one of the biggest challenges for companies. So all companies with 500 or more employees have to also report in the European Union on all human rights implications of their work. Ultimately, to your question, I think where everybody agrees still, and that's why we need this exchange also with countries on the other side of the globe, is that everyone says, okay, nobody, like after what happened in Bangladesh or what happened in Pakistan, the factory that I mentioned, nobody wants the companies to leave the country, of course. And that's, of course, also something I always remind people of that I work with, that even the most left-wing human rights NGOs says, no, of course not. We don't want the sector to collapse. So ultimately, it's definitely the challenge to find a balance here, like what regulations can you impose. But what I see is definitely a challenge. For example, take the garment sector. It was the classic sector on which industrialization sort of took part in the UK, more or less. Yeah? You had a very simple sector which could attract simple labor, untrained labor, and from there countries were able to build a more diverse economy. A challenge that we see, of course, is that Bangladesh, I think at the moment, has wages about $120, $130 per month. A country like China, used to manufacturing place of the world, already pays wages of about $400. So what happens in a globalized economy, I think, not being an economist, just through the eyes of course, somebody that thinks about the conditions for workers, we see that maybe, manufacturing countries, they already move on. Currently, we see a lot of companies moving their production to Ethiopia, where we're looking at monthly incomes, I think, from about $40. So what if we're not regulating enough to sort of let these countries like Bangladesh develop the more diverse economy on the basis of their garment sector, right? So I think also there we can't just leave it to transnational companies at all. I know I'm saying something very critical. It's probably not so much voiced here, but it's at least questions we should think about. And instead of sort of retrieving and being either pro-business or pro-human rights, I think we as Naumann Foundation really trying to get out of the black and white discussion just to think about viable solution. Therefore, we're here. Yeah. But thanks, that's a great question.
Well, for the black and white discussion, some point I want to add. On the one side, you will have the guys who like Argentinian beef. Free trade with Argentinian beef would be marvelous for the whole world, because you have the best beef that I've ever had eaten. But on the other side, there will be people in Germany who will think about Argentina. Argentina, that's in South America. South America is Monsanto. Monsanto is bad, so Monsanto instead, in spite of being just purchased by Bayer, a big German company, when we're going to make a free trade with South America, with Argentina, that could be the entrance door for Monsanto. So you see, that will be the struggle. That's like, on the other side, Argentinian beef is not that good for the vegetarians and vegan people in Germany or in Europe. So that's going to be out of normal thinking. That will be, if that would get a political topic, that would be the discussion, I suppose.
Any further questions?
Black and white.
Further questions? Yeah, please. Give me a microphone.
Are these regulations that you were talking about voluntary? Like if it were from General Assembly, coercive, like if it were from Security Council? And also, if there's the voice of the opposition inside the United States, the United Nations, is this voice of opposition discussing how to regulate, or is there someone that says do not regulate at all, as regards the human right aspect that you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is actually exactly the core of the whole discussion, right? Maybe also to mention what your neighboring country, Ecuador, is pushing for at the United Nations at the moment, and also parliamentarians in Germany are often being faced with the treaty process. So the UN guiding principles, they came out of a treaty process. So they try to establish a legally binding international contract on business and human rights at United Nations in 2003, 2004, and that failed. And I still, as somebody who has also background in United Nations law, I can tell you I don't think we'll have the majorities there. But out of that process, that if you want to discuss this whole topic black and white, it's either the questions: do we have a mandatory law? We have to. Sorry, already getting very enforceable. So do we have to force business, or can we convince business? Right. So it's a long-standing discussion. I won't be able to go in all the details and further to share more, but of course, we are exactly in the middle of it. And if you look to the process in Germany of the implementation of these United Nations guiding principles, we had exactly that situation. So you have the Social Democrats and the Christian Union in the government, and they fell into this exact two two parts. There were big divide. Social Democrats, with the, through the unions that they represent, to civil society groups, they advocated. They wanted to implement a law. We had an NGO network for corporate accountability that had advocated for 10 years just to arrive at such a law. In France, the socialists, they implemented that law shortly before they were kicked out of parliament. So you see how the left and the right, and in I think a country that enjoys a lot of politicization in their politics, it will probably the same thing in Argentina too. That the left-wing political forces will call for a law saying business will never, they're only for profit, they will never really care about social issues like human rights. So it revolves around that. But until now, of course, the guiding principles, they're voluntary, so no country is forced to implement a law. But as I briefly mentioned, so France just passed one, Netherlands will pass one, and we are, in Germany, we are at the moment, they had to strike a consensus, and now we have a deadline. So until 2020, all German companies that have 500 or more employees have to have implemented the guiding principles, and that's due diligence. Otherwise, and that's exact language in the coalition contract, Germany will implement a law. A different question if this law makes sense, because this law, first of all, just asks the companies to create transparency. And if you look to the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, many of you will know it in a different context. The Dodd-Frank Act had also Section 1502, which was on conflict minerals. And it forced companies to report to the SEC on if they had conflict minerals from Central Africa in their supply chain. The outcome is very debatable, because then what happens is businesses will report to create a huge pile of reports with the SEC in this context. And they say, okay, we think we have conflict minerals in our sourcing chain, but we have no proof that it sort of contributes to conflict, right? You see the difficulty. So, I mean, that's at least the attempt to give a brief answer, but you see how wide this field, of course, is. But this is the core question of the whole debate.
Okay.
Hi, it's my turn. Okay. Hi. My question was, how can we limitate this kind of free trade regulations as human rights or environmentals, so they are not used as weapons of protectionism or excuses not to trade in some kind of countries? And if is there anything that the companies themselves can do so they can be socially positively labeled, and therefore the consumers themselves can choose to buy the product or not, instead of the decision go to the government themselves or on any organism, big organism. Yeah, that's what mostly of the question. What can the companies themselves can do so they leave the decision to the consumers, not to the government?
Thank you. Maybe I can briefly say something on the last 2 points, and maybe you will answer what we can politically do against this being used as a weapon against free trade, because it is, I think, a lot. Very briefly, companies are doing already a lot. Often companies that already had a history, the Adidas today is a very company that does a lot. Adidas will not open any factory in Turkey or anywhere in the place without a specialist, which we've worked with, who will analyze the factory and will tell them, okay, here we need escape rooms, we need ventilation, fire protection. So companies have learned a lot. Also, Tesco, for example, if you know Tesco, one of the biggest retailers in the world. I'm just coming back from a tour through Washington and New York with their sustainability manager. It's amazing what they do. Daimler-Benz, for example, they have a human rights lawyer like myself. Actually, as we speak, he's developing a human rights impact assessment. So companies can do a lot. They can create transparency. They can understand themselves where they're sourcing, for example, from, or how their supply chains work. They need to show an interest. And what the most important aspect for companies, I think, is that we need to understand that it's not corporate social responsibility, CSR we're talking about. It's much more an aspect that must be respected also by senior management, right? But yeah, maybe how can we prevent this becomes a weapon?
Well,
Difficult.
It's hard to control the whole world when the whole world is not on the same level of development. Europe used to have child workers in the 19th century without any problem. You had to work with 12 or 11 or 10 years of age for 14, 15 hours in industry, and today nobody would ever let that happen. but there are child workers in Asia or in Africa or in South America in some places without any problems. So it would be nice to have all over the world the same goals and the same thinking, but it's hard to accomplish that. So out of the liberal point of view, it's hard to say, well, not hard to say, it would be nice to say we could make it without any law and that or any regulations of that point worldwide. But the UN is a place to make such treaties and to accomplish a treaty that everybody should have as a goal for the future. So in that point, I think we have to make laws in all the nations on the level they are right by now. And economy, you can catch them at most with money. And if I know that Kick in Germany, it's very cheap, and it's cheap because they getting their stuff and their clothing from Bangladesh and out of the hand of child workers. So if I know that as a customer, I won't buy there anything. And that's what I'm doing, and that's the only thing how you can change the trade out of your own point of view. And before all of us understand how much power we all have enhanced by what we are buying and all what we are doing, we do have to install laws and treaties like that.
Yeah, thank you. Just because you mentioned that the consumer question is also one of the core questions, because a lot of companies like Otto, for example, which is the German retailer like Tesco or Walmart, they're arguing German customers, they don't ask, they don't buy organic so much. They want it cheap, right? So the consumer question is, of course, a very important aspect, but a lot of people who are critical of that, of course, say we need to inform the consumer first, right? So if the consumer doesn't know that Kick sourcing from a horrible factory somewhere in Bangladesh, how can he make an informed decision? But so you see, it's difficult, and if we talk about sectors that don't even have the classical customers, I don't know, intelligence, technology companies, weapon manufacturers. I mean, they don't have like all of us as their customers. So how can we sort of put pressure from the customer side on them, right? But it's a very important aspect. I mean, there are some companies who actually take this as their business model. I don't know if, who knows Fairphone, for example. It's a Dutch company. They produce smartphones only using responsibly sourced minerals. Armed Angels, an increasing number of garment factories. They produce only in factories that are certified. So I mean, we see, at least what I can say from Germany, more and more people asking these questions, and a lot of people argue that will be the same development as in the environmental and organic sector. Well, today nobody buys non-organic eggs anymore, at least in Berlin, where I'm from. So there was, I think there was another one.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, two.
Go ahead.
Hi. One of the main issues in liberalism, or however we want to call it now, is individual rights. So the issue is when you speak of human rights, then there's this whole, I don't know, variety of types of rights, like nature rights and animal rights. And how do you take the focus on it being the individual and not losing virtue and becoming a collective right again? Because then it becomes aimed at a certain type of group, which makes another group vulnerable. And how to make that happen in the case that you respect the smallest minority, which is the individual?
Well, that's definitely an answer I cannot, a question I cannot answer in like a very quick comment. But I think from a liberal point of view, what I always argue, if you talk about, because the question of business human rights ultimately touches upon the question of a more equitable world economic order. So I think focusing on the individual from the point of empowerment, right? So we don't have to protect workers in like, for example, social democrat representative would argue here through creating unions. We need to empower them. We need to free the liberal, free the individual, and empower him to protect himself in a way, right? So I think if you follow that narrative, touching upon basically the origins of political liberalism, you can arrive, I think, also with the political messages that you are sending at a good result, I guess, because this touches also upon the question of an equitable development cooperation and development investments and foreign investments in economic development that, for example, a country like Germany does not with such an angle, which is also part of the discussion, I think. But it's much broader than this. I hope I'm answering your question a little bit.
Well, you are asking for the key of the secret chamber, the treasure chamber. I have no idea how to answer that without talking the whole night about what's going on. In our philosophy, it's not correct that a child works with 10 years of age. But in Bangladesh, that could mean that a family has enough food for the month in working. So if we forbid that kid to work, it can happen that a whole family is pulled over to hunger and poverty in more or less a few days. So what is the correct answer in that moment? Is it correct to say that child has to have its freedom of getting a wonderful upbringing like we all know that in the Western world? Or is it more his right to cover for the family and for the refrigerator they do not have to put food in? So and would there be an answer for education for that boy who's working in that wonderful surrounding over there in Bangladesh? So when you can give me the answer to that, I'll try to cover the whole night with you and answer the question you made.
Okay. We have one very last question.
Yes, this is a short one. How damaged is right now free trade speech in Germany, on one hand with Brexit and on the other with Volkswagen?
Whoa,
I leave this to you. I leave this to the politician.
That's something for the politician, yeah. Well, you see, my answer for the Brexit is we have big problems with Eastern Europe. So my answer is that Germany needs a new queen. So all of the old states of the EG in front of the EU are going under the British crown. And all the problems we have with Eastern Europe, in Poland, with the Catholics, and with Viktor Orban in Hungary, and all that stuff, we put them away. Yeah, that would be the answer for the Brexit question you made. And there's so many problems we are discovering now worldwide. There's so many problems. I'm happy to be here. Here, there's no problem. I haven't seen one today. Everything's fine. Argentina seems to be a wonderful place. You are coping with inflation. That would be something incredible for German people, because we had that too highly inflated times in Germany, and that's like a traumatic thing for German people. Argentina, well, no problem. We had 30% inflation that year. Why not? Yeah. So everything's fine here. I thought it would be more problem over here. So free trade. Everybody has to know that free trade. I said it before, is the answer for the problems with poverty, hunger in the world, and we need free trade, and we don't. We had in Europe a time when. All 10 to 20 miles there were custom stations, like today on the highway here to Rosario. We had 2 or 3 times or 4 times the time when we had to pay for being on the wonderful highway to here. And that was the times before free trade in the old Europe, before South America has been discovered. Yeah, so we don't have to get back in ancient times, and in between friendly countries there never has been something else than free trade. In between the Roman Empire, for example, or in the US, nobody wants to talk about taxes or custom fees between California and the state of New York, for example. But we are talking about taxes and customs fees between the EU and the US. For what sake? Do we need something like Independence Day, that film? That we get the aliens coming here to see that we are all humans all over the world and that we all have the same rights? I don't think so. So that will be the answer for your question.
Well, thank you very much. It has been a very long day for all of us. Thanks for keeping attention here, and I wish you good luck for the next 2 days. We are going back this evening to Buenos Aires because we have another event tomorrow morning. Thank you very much and have a good night. Thanks.